Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the District House. My name is Hannah Jo, and I'm seated here tonight with Dr. Michael Mantz of Santa Barbara Integrative Psychiatry. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Appreciate that.
Yeah, totally. I know that you are currently getting all set up. You just mentioned to me in the Mission Canyon area for your new spot. Is there anything else that you want to share about what's new for you?
Well, that was a big move for us. We actually weren't planning on doing it, and we discovered this beautiful home that we went 5 times and visited, my wife and I, who's also my partner here in my practice, Dr. Kim Lay. And usually we're very complementary. So if one of us, oftentimes we don't converge on like, oh yeah, this is the thing. But if we do, then that's something important. So 5 separate times it converged, and it's like built on the side of like a mountain on Holly Road, and it just had wonderful energy. And it was something we could set up where we could live on the top but on the bottom, establish new therapeutic rooms, because it's really built into the mountain. And I'm actually a big believer in energy, and so oftentimes with psychedelics and even like ketamine, they can have a strong yin component, which oftentimes can disturb the psyche. So you need a grounding force. So oftentimes by having that mountainous type of energy, you can feel, if you feel like you're in like a soothing cave with some nice views of the ocean. And so that setting was important. So we said, I don't know what we're going to do, but let's do the dive. And we did that actually in December. And so we've been now building out, and we just got our therapy room set up. And so we've been starting to see some ketamine patients and getting really positive feedback because, as you know, set and setting is so important.
Totally. And tonight we are talking about some contributors or components that you suggest or utilize in your practice to enhance the efficacy of ketamine treatment. And you've already touched on set and setting and having this grounding and an orientation that's close to the earth to sort of balance the energetics of where ketamine brings you in the treatment. And I also want to hear from you, your interest in ketamine treatment started when and where?
It actually started back in 2019 when a colleague of mine who I really deeply respect, Dr. Jeffrey Becker, he was telling me this is the most powerful tool that we currently have. And he wanted me to experience it. So he guided me, and then he wound up then subsequently training me. And even to this day, if I have a tricky case, he's someone I can call, and he's kind of a mentor to me. So, and I just found it such a profound, so I have ADHD. And with hyperactivity component. So that translates oftentimes I've had a lot of anxiety, and then I've had to work through that kind of anxiety throughout my entire life. So after a while, you can kind of get really good at dealing with the cognitive anxiety, the worries, the thoughts, the what ifs, that kind of thing. But still, there was this underlying component of what I call somatic anxiety, just a restlessness, a discomfort, and unease. And so by pursuing, going through that process, I got to a point where, doing lifestyle factors and everything like that, I was able to get that down pretty well. But you don't realize how much anxiety you have until it's turned off. So when I had that ketamine session, the next morning I woke up and there was nothing. And I was like, holy shit. It's what is that, right? And so I actually cried in that experience. It's like a huge grief pouring came out of my body, because it was honoring all the suffering that I had gone through in my early childhood, not understanding the feelings that were going on inside, and that war that we often have with our own body. So that's been a big journey for me, is coming back into connecting with the body has been really important, because I am more of an obsessive hyperverbal type person. I tend to think a lot. So I've learned through my own balancing and journey is to bring the head into the heart and really emphasize that. So I work with a lot of patients. Most of the time, my wife and I split, where she'll take on more of the pure depressive patients, and I'll take on more of the anxious, depressive types, and obsessive compulsive. So I deal with my peeps who have all their energy up in their head. And so, and oftentimes they're I can't meditate, I can't do this. And I'm it's not meditation. Let's just start to learn to train your attention. You leave your thoughts where they are. Just start to learn to pivot your attention to other parts of your experience, in particular your sensations. So by doing that, it helps ground the mind and the consciousness so that you can just feel more settled and not feeling like a foreigner confronting the world, but actually becoming a part of it. And that's been part of the journey, my own inner journey, and then helping to help others. Yeah.
I imagine that's really helpful for the patients that you work with, being that you've had a similar lived experience. There's probably a felt empathy with what they're going through on top of the services that you're providing them with the ketamine. And I like what you said about it's not about learning to do something you believe you can't do. It's about using the strength of the mind or of the intellect that an individual already has and learning to turn it into the body through focusing on sensation. And it feels really refreshing to hear you talk about this because I feel ketamine is talked a lot about as a disassociative, which I make mean coming up and out of the body. And so you're agreeing, and I also wonder how that relates to this somatic anxiety you experience and how ketamine can actually support people in building a relationship to their body.
Yeah, so we see the dissociative properties of ketamine more at like around what's called 0.5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So if you're a 220-pound person, that'd be about 50 milligrams. If you're a 110-pound person, you're more like 25 milligrams. That's when we start to see the more significant dissociation, like coming out of the body or feeling like the world is changing or shifting. Though just in the lower realms, before you hit that 0.5, you can actually get people where they're actually more embodied. So what we see is like, I was trained also, that's why you see an MH there. I'm also a master herbalist. I was trained in herbal medicine prior to going to medical school. So that's why I have this more energetic kind of quality. That was sort of like my first way of going towards health. Getting back embodied will just simply help you to kind of just be able to understand what it is that's going on inside of you. And it helps you to kind of renegotiate your relationship with your body. And that's one of the things that I found to be, core to helping people get to where they want to go. And with ketamine, you can actually, in the lower end of that spectrum, it has almost an opposite effect of the kind of dissociation effect. And you see this with a lot of different drugs. At lower levels, for instance, an opiate blocker we use called naltrexone. It blocks opiate receptors, but at the very low end of the spectrum, it actually acts like a positive opiate agonist, as we say. In ketamine, it's a dissociative on the higher end, but on the lower end, it actually is almost associative. It makes you more aware of your body because you're more comfortable, so then you can actually sort of like relax and bring your attention inwards. And I will be talking about this. It increases your hypnotic suggestibility. So if one is being guided, which I often do in the beginning, you're more willing and open to go there. So when people have like very difficult sensations to deal with, maybe trauma, that kind of thing, you can imagine now you have like 20 milligrams of ketamine in your body where you're not fully shooting the moon. You're just in this more relaxed, dreamy state, comfortable, relaxed. Now you're able to go into the body, not so fearful of it, and that really helps to renegotiate that relationship because most people are at war with their bodies. What I've seen is that there's 3 emotions that most people do have in regards to their body, and that's disgust, anger, and fear. They're either frustrated with it, I'm disgusted with it, or what is this? Is this an illness? Is this that? That's predominantly most of our relationship with our body. It's not really like we don't generally check in with our body when things are going all right. And so we have this bias of only checking in when things are going quote unquote wrong, that creates this sort of dissociation in life from ourselves. And that's one of the things what's interesting with ketamine, it's like even with the dissociation part, it dissociates, but when you come back, it empowers that reassociation because there's an openness and malleability, and then you take in, hopefully you're doing different life patterns and behaviors in that way, and then as you reassociate, that becomes reincorporated into the body and mind.
Yeah, very powerful. I resonate with everything that you shared. And I think it's interesting that you identified those 3 emotions that people usually embody in relationship to their body, which is not supporting them in their mental health or even their physical health. And I really appreciate how you synthesized that to be able to track that pattern and invite people into the release of those identifications so they can feel more safety and connection to themselves.
That's a beautiful reflection. I was like, someone would be a fantastic psychotherapist, by the way.
Thank you, I received that. Yeah. So in this notion of integrative psychiatry, I sometimes associate the word integrative to like holistic. So when I heard your interest or the beginnings of your path with herbalism, that made me think of that as well. What is your personal definition of integrative?
Integrative is being willing to be open to all the healing modalities, taking what you know and see and study and review what are the best elements from each model, and then synthesizing and weaving them together. So oftentimes, I was trained in the master herbalism was in Western herbalism from like Native American sort of type of herbology. But then I also learned like TCM or Ayurvedic medicine, and then I learned other things about other ancient healing methods, and then along with them going to medical school and learning all the Western medicine stuff. And I have to say, when I first went to medical school, because when some of the training in the herbal school is like, everything in the Western medicine model is terrible, is horrible. So I was really like on the complete opposite end. Like I just wanted to be able to learn. And then because a lot of times when I was working with people as a master herbalist, it's like, yeah, but you're not a doctor. Yeah, but you're not a doctor. So I was like, well, maybe I should pursue that. So, but I was still anti it. But I had my own sort of healing crisis when I was 30 years old. And it took me 6 months to refuse any medication, because I thought that any synthetic medication in my body, and I was going to like never get better. But I really, after about 6 months of really deep suffering, I had to start to take some medicine along with some herbs and supplements and along with acupuncture and functional approach. So it was like my own journey taught me this integrative approach. And so I was like, wow, and it was so powerful. It really required a village. And that's what I think, and it's one of the problems we have in our current model is like how fragmented is our model. You have your cardiologist and your endocrinologist, and no one's talking to each other. They're all overwhelmed and burned out. I'm not blaming them, it's the system that's actually at fault. And so it fractionates, it compartmentalizes, and that's not, I don't see my heart separated or my head separated from my body. So, and then people are just getting overwhelmed and not really getting true care. So they're just getting symptomatic sort of suppression of symptom relief at best, and not really getting anything to the root cause, and then actually getting potentially cure.
So I wanted to ask you this because I know that you're also involved in the standardization and the practice of offering ketamine therapies. And I wonder how it could be possible, or what your ideal vision of the future is, to infuse this integrative approach through the standardization of ketamine.
That's a tricky one, because it would have to require educating people like doctors and practitioners and other people that were interested, because we're just not taught that way. And so education would be the absolute first step to infuse an integrative model, and doing things like, I'm trying to do like talks like this to kind of open up people's minds, because I know there's a lot of creative people out there that are willing to kind of explore unexplored territory in a way that makes sense, not recklessly, but really just like learning. So I love to be able to experiment and learning about different ways in which you can combine things. I mean, that's, as an herbalist, that's kind of like what we do. And so I kind of brought that into the sort of the medical aspects and things like ketamine. And so that's where I find it to be like super helpful to be able to just teach this next generation, or just the people who are willing to learn. Because one of the things that's coming up is that about 20 to 25% of all our general practice practitioners are expected to quit in the next year. This is a JAMA article that came out. Now, what are you going to do? These are actually usually our most empathic people, because they can't handle the load. I mean, can you imagine as a psychiatrist seeing like 10 people a day, for 10 minutes, or 16 people a day who are coming in with trauma, depression? I mean, you've sat with, that, maybe you had it yourself. It takes a lot of energy for that kind of thing. So all they can do is compartmentalize. And then, of course, eventually that has a huge cost, because they're generally empathic people, but now they're getting more sort of imploding, cold, a little more removed, and that cost is huge. And so I even have a couple of friends recently, some of the best primary care doctors I know have quit. So I know these people and a lot of other people are just looking for something different. How can we make this model, improve it, update it, and actually be more incorporative of other things? And we have to go back to our ancient wisdom healing. I mean, there's a reason why some of these things have gone thousands of years. It's not by luck alone or stupidity. It's because a lot of this shit works. And we really need to be able to look at it, get rid of that sort of pompous attitude that we see oftentimes with people with very rigid beliefs. And that's where I see like the movement of psychedelics and ketamine. I know they sometimes don't put ketamine as a psychedelic, but it's mind manifesting. Ketamine's mind manifesting, let me tell you that. So it's a psychedelic. So those things I think are really helpful because of that openness quality. I have seen, even with working with certain people who have that sort of rigidity, we can open it up. So with the right tools and the right environment, I think that's the only thing that's going to save this really desperate situation we find ourselves in.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I want to acknowledge the audience and celebrate us all for coming together for this educational opportunity tonight. And like you said, this is where it begins.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I appreciate your questions, and it's been a pleasure. And I look forward to future talks with you as well.
Yeah, me too. I know we could keep chatting, but I do want to give space for your awesome presentation.
All right.
He's going to present for the next 45 minutes or so, and then we will open into about 15 minutes of audience Q&A. So as things float to the surface for you in your presentation, take a mental note of that, and I will invite you to share your voice at the end of the presentation. I'll see you then.
Tools that enhance the efficacy of ketamine. As I said, I'm a medical doctor and a master herbalist, and I'm also part of the expert faculty of the American Society of Ketamine Physicians, both with my wife and I in our practice. We're both part of that. We're actually part of the standards committee because it's kind of like the wild, wild west out there right now, and we really want to make sure that ketamine is the leading horse that's bringing in all the other potential psychedelics on there. So we have to treat this really powerful, awesome tool with great care. So the ketamine experience, what's it like? So you go from alert, and then when we first used ketamine, it was an anesthetic, so boom, you're out, lights out. Now you can imagine you have a little bit of a dial, so you can now control the dose, and so that we can go from this alert to a little more of a dreamy state. Do we want to amplify that dreamy state? So I often have patients, like, if I want to have a little bit more of a kind of a talk, so we don't want to get to a point where they can't talk or a little bit more impaired, I might give them a little small dose. Yeah, we do it through intramuscular injection, and then we'll start talking to them in that case. So now the person's a little more open, a little more relaxed, and then I might do a little bit more. Now, other people, we might want to like shoot the moon and really try to go for a transcendent and a larger experience. Then I might then shoot with a larger dose. So by just controlling that, we can go and control how deep into that sort of dreamy state do we want to be. When we look at science, the ketamine, when you use EEG monitoring, it resembles a little bit like stage 1 sleep. And for those of us science geeks out there, that's like a gamma burst pattern from gamma to theta. And so that it's like you're going like from going down and up, just like stage 1. You're kind of waking up and then you're going back to sleep, and you're going waking up and come back to sleep. And that's in that stage is when the brain is very open, and it can actually take in a lot more and be like a sponge to information. Now, I just wanted to put up there the K-hole. So oftentimes what thought about, we don't really see this in our clinic, and the reason why is that the K-holes, what most people we think is that when people are usually using ketamine recreationally, they're usually snorting it or insufflating it. So they'll snort it a little bit, but what happens is that there's secondary metabolites that are building up, and as they go longer into it, they're actually reaching the threshold of anesthesia. So that's why it collapses in. They feel sort of removed out, and it can barely move. It's because they're almost going under completely. So that's what the K-hole is. And to people who've had, the big thing is the dissociation aspect. Again, I like to call it, because that word has a negative connotation. It's more like a positive dissociation. Imagine yourself, you're depressed or anxious, and you're really uncomfortable in your own body, and you just let go, and then all of a sudden, your mind and your consciousness just felt to expand, and you're outside of your body. You're free. You're liberated. That liberation allows you to just feel like, what a relief. And so that's one of the more powerful things. And what we look for, it's what's called depersonalization in the technical terminology. That's what we look, and it actually is correlated with overall benefit with ketamine. The perceptual changes, like comparatively to like other psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin, where you might open your eyes and see trails and all, you're not going to get that with ketamine. You might get some distortions, like things might look farther away or closer, or objects may look bigger, or like your feet may look a little bit further away, but you're not going to get any kind of like trails or any kind of major visual distortions. That said, with your eyes closed, people will oftentimes have very profound visualizations. So closed-eyed visuals is very prominent, though some people, they might not have that at all. So that varies from person to person. There's an enhanced sensitivity, and particularly to sound and light, and that's why music is such an important element with ketamine, or any psychedelic for that matter. So it's like you can just feel, it feels like a more surrounding sound experience, but it also, what it seems to enhance is the kinesthetic response to music. So we're getting more in that emotional level. You can feel it more, and that's why it can be really important. And there's a difference between if you want to guide it more sort of spontaneously, just let whatever happen unfold, and then there's times when you might want to guide it towards, say, grief or anger or some of these other emotions that a person's having trouble with. So then you might want to guide like with certain types of music. And I've explored that, and it's been very, very interesting that you can do both stimulating music and also calming music at the same time. So that's one of the things that's really helpful. And then the last is the transcendent experiences, which is now mapping out to be where we see the most bang for your buck from ketamine when people have these transcendent experiences. And one of the biggest components of that is having the patient feel safe and secure, so they feel willing and trusting to let go. That seems to enhance it the most. So how does it work? Well, ketamine is a very promiscuous molecule. It loves to touch all kinds of different receptors and do all kinds of things. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but the main one is glutamate. And just to simplify things, glutamate is related to both growth. It stimulates brain growth, how the neurons wire together, how the synapses, where the receptors are, how they are reforming themselves. And so by doing that, it also enhances learning, or the potential for learning. The other really main one is the dopamine. So we have our reward center, and that's mainly modulated by dopamine. So like if you do a task, a goal, and you go from A and you get to B, you get a dopamine hit in that reward center. Hey, you did a good job. Or we can circumvent that by using certain substances that like to trigger the reward center without doing the goal-oriented behavior. Again, that's modulated by dopamine. We live in a very high dopamine stimulating society, from the screens that we use, from the coffee that we might drink, we like stimulants. We stimulate. And often even all the things that sort of calm us down are also dopamine often agonists as well. So what we tend to how many of us have been feeling burnout in the last couple of years, right? Like, it's hard. We are in information overload. I call it infobesity. And it's a cognitive loading. Like, we do this in studies. We want to stress you. We give you one task. Then we give you another task. Then we give you another task. And that cognitive load, you get overwhelmed. And so that's what a lot of us are facing today. You have to look at your phone, you have to look at this, you got to go over here, and we're kind of burning out this circuitry. So nature has the thing is, if you overstimulating, it puts a brake on that reward circuitry, and that's when you start to notice that things that normally would give you a good pleasure are kind of like lackluster now. Oh, I used to listen to that song, it gave me such a good feeling, now it's flatlined. And so when we start seeing that, we know that this brake is starting to activate. And one of the interesting things about ketamine, its rapid antidepressant effect, is the unlocking of that brake, what a lot of people like to call the reset, so that you're actually more likely to get motivated again. And so one of the things, the anhedonia component of depression, I've seen in my patients, when they have a stronger component of that, they often seem to respond to ketamine better, and that if they're having that issue. There's a lot of pain relief. There's a modulation of the opioid receptor, some serotonin, and then one also with pain relief and also stimulating growth at low dose is the cannabinoids as well, because I'm going to go into that a little bit, because I like to actually use cannabinoids often with my patients with ketamine. I want to start off with the fundamental K, so it's called K+. So K+, comprehensive history and assessment in labs. This sets the stage for a personalized treatment, and also it's because it's important that if we try to cookie cutter this process, it's going to not really gain the most bang for your buck for what you're doing with ketamine, especially if you're going to be doing a series of ketamine treatments. You're going to be making a serious investment. So by establishing a comprehensive history and getting labs, what we want to do is we want to create a mind map for the patient so that we can get the orientation of where we need to go to accomplish the goals that the patient is bringing us. Also, like if you go through a quick medical thing, it's like right away the connection that you have with that person is going to feel a little bit cheapened because it's really important to establish a therapeutic alliance. So when you're doing ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, any therapy, whether it's CBT, DBT, psychodynamics, interpersonal therapy, whatever it is, when we look at it in the studies, the number one factor that contributes to whether that patient is going to do well with that therapy is the therapeutic alliance. It doesn't matter actually what the actual therapy. If you have a strong therapeutic alliance, we are social species. And that therapeutic alliance is talking about people about very intimate details and being non-judged for that. Such a powerful thing. So by having this longer assessment, listening to these intimate details, having that person feel understood and listened to, that establishes that therapeutic alliance, and we're now priming the pump for having a better experience. The main way I like to think about setting up the assessment history is the biopsychosocial, as Robert Engel established that. Now they've added, and I think it's an important one, and the spiritual element. So obviously you want to medically clear, but we also want to know what is the person feeding their body? How are they nourishing it? How are they moving it? How are they sleep? Because sleep is extremely important, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But just as important is you need to get a roadmap by that person from their childhood conditioning, which establishes the emotion, thought, and behavior and action patterns that go on for life. Because most of the time, our brain can't handle that much information. So what it does is it quickly turns them into unconscious habits. So a lot of times, your belief systems, how you're responding, it's all being done unconsciously. So if it's not leading to total destruction of your life and you're still surviving, there's no need to update it. But by bringing it up in therapy, some of these maladaptive patterns that might come up, you bring them on the workbench, and that's when you can modulate them. And that's how ketamine can really enhance a lot of that effectively. And so if you don't get that full history, then where are you going to go? Where are you going to point the tool? This is a powerful gun. Where are you going to point it? So that's why getting the map is important. The other thing, social, is also important because a lot of times when some of my ketamine patients weren't responding, they didn't have enough social connection. They were lonely. How many of us are feeling bereft of social, I call it social nutrition, feeling that you can have people you can have an intimate conversation with, that you feel like you can feel enriched with. A lot of us aren't. So again, then what we would do is then if a person's bereft of that, then when we're doing the ketamine and they're getting that little extra motivation, we can then aim them as one of their goals is to connect out more, reach out more, feel willing to do that. And then spiritual is values and value-guided behavior, really getting a sense of your values. What's nice about that is not like a specific goal. It's more like a compass. Like, what is it that drives you? And I often will tell people, just pay attention to how you are in the next week and what lights up your interest, even a little bit, and just write it down. And just keep writing that down. Anything that invokes your curiosity or interest or enthusiasm, even a tiny bit, just write it down. Because your body's going to tell you. And that's, again, where we drive when I'm working with people is going into the body, because that's where you feel it. That's where it matters. And similarly, getting purpose and meaning. In addition to that, looking under the hood, labs and other testing. When I first started doing ketamine back in 2019, with my patients who are my general patients that I also did ketamine with, I always did the labs, but sometimes I would get like psychiatrists sending me their patients and being a subspecialist. And I made a mistake. I didn't emphasize labs always with them. And so with some of the patients where I started seeing this pattern, it's like, I call it the bang, then bust pattern. They get a nice response for a couple days and then they bust. And then they go bang, and then they bust. And they bang, and they bust. And so they're like, wow, something must be happening here. So with ketamine, it's going to be stimulating neuroplasticity and everything like that. But it's not Jesus Christ coming down and modulating your mood. You're going to need other factors. The brain is a complex, and nervous system is complex and is related to all the other body parts. So I started now making it everybody who gets ketamine, we look under the hood. Some of the important ones, B6, 9, and 12. For those of us who like that, those are your methylation pathway B vitamins, and a lot of us have methylation difficulties. And why is that important? Well, methylation, the pathways are the pathways in which your body generates neurotransmitters, how it generates energy, and detoxes the brain. So very important. So I can be giving you ketamine, but if you don't have enough folic acid in the brain, if you don't have enough B12, it's not going to correct that. And so you might get, that's why sometimes you get a little bit of a bang from it and then you bust. And so other things like iron is an important one. A lot of people, I like to do what's called a ferritin test, which actually looks for iron storage. A lot of us, because I tend to treat a lot of ADHD, and so even in that case, a lot of my ADHD patients, even men, will see like lower ferritin levels, suboptimal. What's wrong with that? Well, iron is really important for dopamine production. So that, in addition to obviously blood cell and oxygenation of the body. So oftentimes we might have to, I like to use through diet first. So I would increase things like grass-fed beef and things like that to try to get more iron into the body rather than using supplemental iron. But anyway, I just want to move on from there. So then we also want to look at metabolic markers. Why? Well, there's a great book I highly recommend. It's called Brain Energy. Harvard psychiatrist Dr. Christopher Palmer made a very cogent case on the fact that, like, if you take all the mental illnesses, the final common pathway is metabolic derangement. And that was his argument in the book. So if you're insulin resistant, if you're having problems with like your triglycerides, if you're having like a lot of different things, then your body is not going to be functioning optimally, and your brain's going to tell you. And your brain's usually going to tell you either through anxiety or shutting down, feeling depressed. Inflammation is another one. I mean, one of the biggest factors, the two biggest factors if you want to think about for depression is lack of growth in the brain. It's sort of like shutting down, so it's not as malleable, not as adaptive, and also inflammation. So we want to take a look at that as well. I see a lot of anxious patients, so steroid analysis is really important because if you're a high anxiety person and you've been dealing with that for years and maybe you haven't been sleeping well, oftentimes I see testosterone levels starting to plummet. I see your adrenals, hormones like DHEA, sulfate, and cortisol. They're starting to either be dysregulated, and DHEA in particular starts to go down. So oftentimes what I found was I had a couple patients where they were getting like 3-4 days of benefit, and then they were kind of busting. And then all of a sudden you start adding in things like the DHEA, and you start adding in things like B12, and all of a sudden, and now all of a sudden you're starting to see they're getting a lot longer responses. So you want to expand that window of opportunity so that you can insert those healthy behaviors so they become habits. The other things I do is, if needed, in sleep studies, and also we're going to be working with a company to start doing more genetic testing as well. So I want you to think of two major effects that ketamine does. It increases neuroplasticity. So I think most of us know what neuroplasticity is, but just in case you don't, the brain is such a wonderful organ that given how your behaviors are and your environment is, it will start to change and shape the shape of your brain and how it wires together and how the synapses are made. That structural change is called neuroplasticity, and that's one of the main ways that ketamine, which increases something called brain-derived neurotropic factor. We just like to call it brain fertilizer. You can think of it that way. And the mTOR, that's an anabolic pathway. A little interesting side note, it's not only anabolic for your brain, but it's actually anabolic for your muscles too. It will actually increase muscle growth and protein synthesis. But when you're entering into this heightened state of growth, you can then learn new habits much more quickly. Like, you imagine yourself like when you first started to try to learn how to ride a bike. At first, it's like really awkward. Why? Because you have to be very conscious of every little thing at that particular point. So your neurons, they're firing. New neurons are firing together, but they're awkward until all of a sudden, you keep repeating it. So that's where you have focused attention and repetition. You keep repeating it and then getting good sleep in between. Then all of a sudden, the neurons that are firing together, boom, they wire together. That's Hebb's law. So that when they wire together, that's when it no longer requires that effort that you're noticing anymore, and neuroplasticity has occurred. The other main effect on there is the increased suggestibility. And this is when the brain is more open. And we see this across the board with all psychedelics, whether it's LSD, psilocybin, it's this increased openness. In fact, in that one study by Charles Grove, when they looked at the trait openness. It's one of the 5 main traits in our personality. After just that one session, they were still having increased openness after 12 months in that particular study. So we see openness also with ketamine as well. And that openness allows you to gain new insights, new ideas, new perspectives. Because one of the things we see when we start to get burnt out, when we're feeling anxious, when depressed, is our brain, when it's getting more inflamed, it's less malleable, it's more rigid, it gets kind of stuck. And how much of us get, when we're getting sort of stressed out, our mind goes into these mental cul-de-sacs over and over and over and over, chasing its own tail. It's called rumination. Rumination is the #1 cognitive risk factor for depression. Because what happens is you're ruminating, and then you're at night, and you're trying to go to bed, and then your brain's and what's happening is it's usually self-referential, and it's usually negative. And you're trying to problem solve, but you're in a closed system at that point, so you're screwed. So that's the thing is, so we need to break that cycle, break those patterns, open up the whole mind, and then insert new patterns that are pro-adaptive and healthy. It's also a hypnotic potentiator, that enhanced suggestibility. So for those of us who've ever done therapy, and my wife and I had the great fortune in our 4th year of residency to take a hypnosis course at UCLA. So those of the people who do know hypnosis, a lot of guided meditation has a lot of hypnotic elements in there. It's the way you're suggesting. You just notice your body just relaxing on the chair. That's a suggestion. So that's the thing that ketamine can enhance. So for those of us who do like to have like positive affirmations and things like that, for some of us that doesn't really work very well. But for others, it might work a little bit. That will be enhanced. You have a window of enhancement after you've done ketamine with it. And also because of that openness and willingness to change and everything, it aids in psychotherapy. So I want to now look at neuroplasticity in particular and how I think about what I'm going to add on to K plus what. So the first K plus was the clinical assessment and the history in a lab. So again, that establishes the map. Now we have the map and we have the orientation. We know the values, we know the goals, we know what we're aiming at. And that's why it's so important. And we're establishing the therapeutic alliance. That's the way to prime the pump. Now with neuroplasticity, we have this tool that's stimulating neuroplasticity. Well, what can we do with that? Maybe to enhance it. Well, one avenue is to augment that neuroplasticity. It's kind of similar to like wishing for more wishes, but just add tools that really augment the neuroplasticity component, stimulate it even further. The other one is to support that neuroplasticity. It's just stimulating the growth, but it needs then the raw materials to really build in that new growth. So you don't want to give it shoddy materials, so you want to make sure it's got the best materials. So by supporting neuroplasticity. Then the third thing is driving that neuroplasticity towards healthy, pro-adaptive, and value-guided behaviors. So that's the way to think about it. So any tools that augment the neuroplasticity, support it, or drive it into those healthy behaviors, and there's a lot of tools that do that. You can think of potentially merging it with ketamine and enhancing its effects. So one of the biggest ones is sleep. We see in studies that if a person's sleep is poor and it remains poor after ketamine, it's not that ketamine's going to be able to fix that. And actually, like sleep is I think, the most important behavior that we consume. What other behavior do you have to do 7, 8, 9 hours of every day? Nothing even comes remotely close. So I really focus on helping to a person, because most people I see usually have some issue with sleep, whether it's they have trouble falling asleep, whether they're getting fragmented, whether they're waking up too much. Maybe they're sleeping through, but they still feel tired in the morning for some reason, or they're not noticing any dreams anymore. These things are important things to have in order to have overall brain health. Sunlight. It's a very important factor. It stimulates neuroplasticity. It stimulates things like testosterone and things like that are anabolic. It also helps with pain relief, and it also helps get you sleeping good. So I often have patients go outside for 10 minutes in the morning to establish that circadian rhythm and also be out during sunset. Body movements, how are you moving your body? If you're not moving your body, I don't care. You don't have to do like any kind of go to a gym, but move your body. That's what life is. If you're not moving your body, you're not really living life to its fullest. And then, of course, we talked about social nutrition. And also, it's also the refraining or abstinence from some of our maladaptive behaviors, because then you allow the neuroplasticity to go towards those pro behaviors and let go of those old behaviors. That's the way to think about it when using ketamine. So this is more that second level, support. Give it the best materials. Our brain is 60% fat. So we really want to emphasize healthy fats with our patients. So number one is the omega-3 fatty acids, because the 35% of your brain is made out of something called DHA, which is a long-chain omega-3 fatty acid, which we only find in things like salmon, sardines, anchovies, trout, mackerel. So that's where you get those long-chain fatty acids. Now you can also supplement. It's not quite the same, but I like to usually combine the two. But you can get some of the smaller chain omega-3 fatty acids and things like walnuts and chia. The problem is that as we get older, it gets harder to make those smaller chains into the longer chains, and particularly with women for that reason. Omega-9 is also important. That's your oleic acid, like olive oil. That has to be raw. You can't cook it. It loses that benefits. And avocados. And think of that as sort of like when you're dealing with some patients with cardiovascular issues, or their blood is just not flowing very well, you want to it's like giving lubing up your entire circulation system. That's what omega-9 is. It has that, and it helps protect it. It has anti-inflammatory components. So by lubing it up and getting it ready to go, because one of the things that ketamine does is it increases blood flow to the brain. So it's like, let's get that lubed up, so when the blood flow, it goes nice and smooth. So, we know lube is important, so I'm just kidding, sorry. I had to make it a little funny. On that note, egg yolks. But things like egg yolks, by the way, like pasture-raised eggs, they have things called phospholipids, which are the most the most highest percentage lipid in our brain. So again, feeding what the brain wants and needs. Grass-fed butter is another one. 35% of your brain, 60% is fat, 35% of your brain is protein. So we want to give it really high quality protein. So grass-fed like beef and bison and these kind of things, fish, pasture-raised eggs, whey protein, those kind of things are very important. Some of my patients who were not getting quite the bang for their buck kind of thing, I noticed that they weren't eating enough protein afterwards. Sometimes they were getting that little bit of nausea, and so maybe they didn't eat that much that day, and then they didn't eat as much the following day, and then it wasn't as robust of a response. And then when we corrected that, we started seeing a much more robust response. The fruit section, these fruits are more on stimulating that neuroplasticity. So anything like your berries, cherries, grapes, palm seeds, things that are blue and red and those colors. So it's like red or black grapes. They stimulate neuroplasticity. So again, that's kind of like augmenting the effect. And again, your leafy greens, allium is onion family, and the cruciferous vegetables, they too support that neuroplasticity component. So we got some time, so I can actually play with this. This is only a short list. I actually have a lot more supplements that I use with ketamine. The first one, curcumin. That's from turmeric root. It's the phytochemical. So it's hard to absorb, so I use the kind of a liposomal form for increased absorption. And black seed oil. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, but it's black cumin seed oil. And those two are my 1-2 punch for anti-inflammatory herbs and phytochemicals. So people with they're coming in, often, most times, over 45% of people with depression also coming in with a pain-related condition. So oftentimes with those type of people, I would love to add on an anti-inflammatory component. If I looked under the hood and I saw an elevated a CRP level or something like that, I would put them on curcumin and black seed oil. Moving down to those blue ones, these are the ones I tend to use for patients who are ADHD, traumatic brain injury. You could be a post-stroke people. Mild cognitive impairment is one group I really love to work with because that's at the point where you can actually reverse. Once you get to stage 1 Alzheimer's, MCI is actually the predecessor towards Alzheimer's. It gets much harder to reverse at that point. So MCI, though, you actually have the opportunity to reverse that. And so things that I might use for those type of people are like ginkgo biloba, which increases the blood flow to the brain. Again, that's kind of augmenting ketamine's already brain blood flowing capacity. Phosphatidylserine, that's in your membrane. So your membranes are made of lipids or fats. Phospholipids are the type of fats that your brain stores in the membranes of its neurons. So you can think of your neurons kind of like wiring. And then if you're wiring, the kind of the covering, the outer part, If that starts to fray, then the signal is going to there's going to be more resistance to the signal, and it's not going to travel as well. So things like phosphatidylserine are very important to be in that membrane so that it signals faster with greater precision and accuracy. So I like using that a lot as well. Lion's mane, those of you who are familiar with the Paul Stamets protocol, he likes to use that with his psilocybin microdosing. I like to use it with ketamine as well. It has its own nerve growth factors and anything like that. It has some cognitive enhancing factors. One of the things I find with ketamine, it actually happens oftentimes in women who are over the age of 50, is they're more prone to having the cognitive impairment transiently when you have ketamine. And that can be distressing for some people. So if it's not really distressing for some people, I'm okay with that. But some people, they get they're trying to find their words and they can't quite find it and they're getting upset at it. What I will often do is then add some of these elements to it tends to help the brain to recover quicker and be able to verbalize. Also, if I'm doing it where I might give them the ketamine really quickly up front so that we can also process and do more psychotherapy on the tail end, I would probably do that so that we can actually have more time on that tail end to be able to talk and work through things. Creatine. How many people are familiar with creatine? Okay, you probably heard it as we're working out at muscle. Well, actually, it's important for not only our muscle, but also our cardiac muscle, our heart, and also for our brain. They've done studies where they compare people who've had strokes and heart attacks, both people who've supplemented with creatine and those who did not. And the ones who were supplementing with creatine, they actually had less brain cell damage or heart cell damage. They were more quickly to recover. Now, why would that be? Well, creatine, you can just think of it as an ATP, which is your energy currency in your body, as an ATP reservoir. Because when you're using it for weightlifting, it helps you when you're doing sort of anaerobic training. So when you're at that rep number 7 and 8, you're just trying to eke it out. You start supplementing creatine. That last one, you're getting out. And then after a while, you get stronger from that. So that's what creatine does there. Now, you can imagine if your brain were in that terrible situation of a stroke or heart attack, it's needing energy, because if it doesn't get energy, it's going to die. So what's nice about it is that your brain with creatine, it doesn't require any kind of fancy transporter. You have these cool cells in your brain. They're called astroglia, and they regulate the synapses in your brain, and they communicate with each other in a network. They're like one of the coolest cells. I'm a little bit of a geek with that. But they also will note in their network, hey, if there's more energy needed back there, they can shift the creatine over there through diffusion and support that system. So with ketamine, even though it's an anesthetic and it's lights out, what's really interesting about it, it's also a psychostimulant. It has stimulating properties to it, and it increases blood flow and glucose in the brain utilization. So it can be for some people who are really on the down and out and just tired. It's like sometimes that can be a little overstimulating. So to be a helpful agent to protect that, to give that reservoir for that person, I often have them start to supplement with creatine. There's several studies now with creatine, 2 of them with women in middle-age level who used it as an adjunct to their SSRI or anything, and they found significant benefits. And they were able to get they were in partial remission, and many were able to get into full remission after adding creatine to it. So I love creatine. I use it myself. I recommend it to most people. Unless you have pre-existing kidney issues, then don't. But otherwise, it's safe. The last one I want to spend a little bit of time with, and that is the cannabinoids. Let me see. I have a pretty good time. I was able to work with a couple people with ketamine, and in some instances, you'll get a person who has like a dark experience. And oftentimes, those dark experiences can be the most helpful, profound experiences. And afterwards, like, man, I didn't like that experience, but afterwards, like working with them through it, that can be extremely like cathartic and therapeutic. However, there are some times when people get a dark experience, another dark experience, another dark experience. And I was like, and you can see they're starting to get demotivated and sort of like, it's too much pummeling. Like we need I consider those more of like the detox period. But sometimes you want to strengthen the system first before you detox it. So what I'll sometimes do is try to shift it a little bit. And one of the agents I like to do that with is with THC. THC is interesting because at low dose, though, that's a key. See, at low dose, THC increases brain neuroplasticity And it actually has anti-inflammatory capacity. They've actually have studies at low dose, like 2 milligrams, 3 milligrams for Alzheimer's, and showing that it reduces beta amyloid plaque and reduces neuroinflammation. However, just like I was talking about with Hannah, is that a lot of these drugs will have different effects depending on what pole you're sitting on. So go high on the cannabinoids, and now all of a sudden you will suppress neuroplasticity. You will increase neuroinflammation. So that's why you have to be careful with these things. So I'll often use that. And what's interesting with THC is that it activates a very primal circuitry. And I think any of us who've used THC, I'm sure a lot of us here have used it, it activates the play circuitry. This is there's 7 primal emotions. I'm not going to go into all of them, but one of the primal mammalian emotions is play. Look outside. Your dogs, your cats, rats, any of them, they all like to play a lot and all that kind of thing. It allows us to express sort of like our aggressive impulses in playful ways and socially. That's how we learn how to express it in socially acceptable ways. Just a little bit of a side, those of us with ADHD often have a higher need for play. Just like an extrovert has a higher need for socialization, ADHD need a higher need for play. So oftentimes you increase your play, you'll notice the reduction in ADHD symptoms. And I often do use cannabinoids low dose with my ADHD patients. I've found it to be pretty beneficial. So with activating that play circuitry, all of a sudden, what you'll often get, if you do get closed-eyed visuals, you often get a potentiation of those closed eyes. They'll be more vivid or more open, more playful. What happens is that your willingness to sort of explore new terrains and everything like that just becomes more open. It kind of turns on the backlight of your mind so that you're actually able to just have a more broader range of experiences. Again, not for everybody. Some people, that would be a terrible choice to make. But for some people, it actually becomes it can be transformative. The other one is CBD. That often I use with a lot of those people with brain trauma. They've had, or mild cognitive impairment. They have the neural inflammation aspect. So I want to add in a little bit of CBD. Maybe I want to do a little bit of both with the THC and the CBD again, a little bit together. I like it because it's like you have like different keys that you can kind of press, and which chord do you want to hit based on their history and their labs and what you're seeing as you're progressing. You're constantly trying to update to personalize the treatment to them to get the best effect. Are you familiar, anybody with CBG at all? So CBG is starting to become more popular. It's kind of considered the mother of all the cannabinoids, and from which all the other cannabinoids usually was found in the really like really young plants, but now they were able to hybridize it, and now that we're able to make plants so it's not super expensive anymore. It's interesting. It kind of mimics a natural endocannabinoid in our body called anandamide. Ananda in Sanskrit means bliss. So it's an amide of bliss. And it sort of touches both the CB1 and the CB2 receptor, and generally has it for most people. Again, not everybody. Some people will have the opposite experience. But a lot of people, it'll give them that sort of uplift, feeling just more uplifted, just nice general. It's not. What's interesting in combination with ketamine, it definitely seems to enhance the visuals a lot in that way, in conjunction with a little bit of the THC. So again, if the person's just like not kind of lifting up, I want to lift them up a little bit more and then give them an extra ketamine oomph. Oftentimes I'll combine it with CBG. And then we have CBN. Anybody familiar with that? Yes. So you can think of N as nighttime. So it's great for sleep, and that way, again, when we look at the studies for ketamine, whether you're getting long-term benefits, if the person's sleep quality is still poor, it's a very low chance that person's going to have sustained benefits. So I want to reestablish their sleep. And one of my favorite tinctures, and I don't get any payment from them, SunMed over there is actually really good. They have a sleep tincture there that has CBN, high quality. The problem is, like, you have some of these companies that they do really well, and then they get bought out, and then their quality goes down because they have now. So I'm hoping they do well, but I don't want them to do too well because their product actually is really solid. I use that a lot in a lot of my patients, so you like that. So now we're moving on to that suggestibility, openness, malleability. So you're opening up your mind. You're allowing it to be it becomes a sponge, and you can imprint it very easily. So obviously this is the case of K plus optimal set and setting. So what I often tell my patients to do is, before they have their first treatment, the night before, start creating a home retreat space for yourself. Use your 5 senses. You think of the 3 S's and the 2 T's, the sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. What sights that you would like to look at that would be soothing? or nourishing or inspiring? What sounds would do that for you? Smells, tastes, touches. That helpful guide, and start to create a little bit of a space, even if it's just a tiny space for yourself that you can retreat to. When I didn't emphasize this that much in the beginning, oftentimes I was finding my patients, and then they would come back and they would be like, yeah, I was just like, oh, it was terrible, like next day. And I said, well, what did you do when you went home? Well, I had to go do this and go for work, and then I had to do this with this person. And I'm like, because you actually can get negative. With neuroplasticity in itself is not positive. There's negative neuroplasticity too. One famous example of that would be addiction. Right? You smoke, not a big deal, smoke, but then eventually you're feeling addicted. Now, I got to start smoking. Guess what? Your brain has changed. It's rewired itself to want that cigarette in that way. So they can go either way. And that's the same thing why it's so important that who you work with, who you're being guided by has experience and training and actually understands the intricacies of the mind so that you can help that person, especially if they get caught in some really difficult space. So creating that home retreat space, limiting exposure to negative and hyperstimulating stimuli. So we are loaded with it. I mean, our phones, TVs, laptops. It's just our brains weren't designed for that kind of thing. It's like boom, boom, boom. And they've designed it to increase that quick dopamine hit. You know, oftentimes with a lot of my ADHD patients, they get caught up in playing a lot of like games a lot. Even before, you know, I often try to say, all right, you can do your games after you've done some work, because what you're doing is you're short-circuiting the system. You're not doing the work, and you're getting the bonus, and then that gets hardwired into the brain. So then you try to do work, and you can't, because you're like, why not? I'd rather just play the game. I don't have to expend any energy. Naturally, our effortless, the natural state is effortless. We just naturally want to be just not doing very much, but we have to be able to utilize that dopamine circuitry wisely. So you really want to eliminate that. And then, because I have a lot of people, then they go watch the news or they listen to this. I'm like, don't do that. like try to give your brain some time off, because you want to absorb as much of the things that you want to help you with the goals that you want to achieve. So before session, I emphasize exercise. I like people to go, even if they can just go for a walk. Again, you're stimulating neuroplasticity again. You're priming the pump. You're getting the person to start new behaviors as they go into it. Like, yeah, I'm a person who moves my body and I'm comfortable in my body. Breath work I like to do. One of the things that I like to do is like the double inhale, and that's something we can maybe do in the Q&A somewhere, because I'm noticing I only have 5 minutes. But sunshine, again, another component that I mentioned. During the session, it's really important, because a lot of people have a lot of anxiety coming into the session, is to shift them. There's often, you would read from going from doing to being, and I find that's too big of a jump for most people, but going from doing to receiving. Just receive the voice that you're hearing from me. You don't have to listen hard. Your body naturally, all your sensing is happening effortlessly. How you hear my voice, how you decode what I'm saying. No effort is required, but we notice there's this like tendency to lean in and strain. So trying to get the person to relax, open, let go. Because as I think any of us who've done psychedelics, you hit some sort of wrinkle and you tighten. To the degree you resist is the degree you're going to suffer. The degree you can let go, it can be a lot better. And that's in life too. So, and then after sessions, because some people can get amped. Some people are really tired afterwards. Some people are pretty amped. So I often have them do a sunset walk. It's one of the most important times for recalibrating your circadian rhythm is when the sun is actually descending and the changing colors are happening in front of you. Your eyes can detect that changing color, and it's really powerful. Oh, it's the sun going down. So it's one of the most important times of recalibrating your circadian rhythm. And then things like, you have this sponge. What do you want to add to it? So guided meditations, hypnosis, gratitude. I often what I do is I will chart notes for the ketamine session. Then I take a picture for myself, and then I hand the notes to the patient and I tell them an hour before you go to bed, read your notes. Because one thing about ketamine, it's like a dream. If you don't go back to it, you're going to forget a lot of stuff. So coming back when the brain is kind of going back into that twilight state, which is so that sort of state-dependent memory. So when they're in that hour before bed, it's a perfect time to review the notes and then expand on them. And then to do things like gratitude practice, which is sort of It's sort of a strategy we have a natural negativity bias. We look at what's wrong, what's the problem. So by going with the gratitude, you're training, it's like a cognitive training of, it doesn't matter actually if you feel the gratitude, it's just picking out the gratitude. That's really important. That's what helps. And that can also help deepen that quality of sleep. And then of course some journaling is important. Ketamine and psychotherapy, so the importance of setting an intention, so that you're not just sort of like having some fun out here. No, I'm coming in with, what is it that I really want? What is it that I desire? What is it that's really important in my life? And so that you're really starting to, when you're doing that, you're starting to bring alive those circuits in your brain so that they're ready, center stage for the treatment that's about to come. Even if the session doesn't even actually seem to be about what the intention is, it seems to have the way of making that this matters and is important, and it'll be something that's really important as well. It increases episodic memory recall. And this is where it can be tricky, where a lot of people are taking ketamine from home, especially doses that are high in that way, is that all of a sudden, I've treated several patients now, more than on my hand, who were traumatized either from ketamine and psilocybin, because what happened was when they had a ketamine session, they went home, and then all of a sudden, they didn't even know they had a trauma, and boom, a memory came in. And then they went to call the place, like, hey, what do I do? And they had no therapist, nothing. And they're like, oh, I think you should see a psychiatrist and a therapist. Try doing that when you're not feeling bad. It's hard right now. Try doing it when you didn't realize you were traumatized, and now all of a sudden you're sat with this mess on you, and you don't know what to do. So that's why, like, I'm part of that standards committee to make sure that each clinic has mental health professionals that are trained and experienced. The interesting thing about memory, hopefully I have enough time, is the reconsolidation aspect. So we think like memory sometimes is just sort of stored and that's it. It's in long-term storage. But one of the things that happens is that when you re-bring up a memory, so for instance, it's like a difficult memory, and you start talking about it, and you're going to start feeling it a little bit more. It's now back on the workbench. It can be changed. So my wife does a therapy. It's called accelerated resolution therapy. If anybody's familiar with EMDR, where it has bilateral stimulation, it's an offshoot of that. So with the bilateral stimulation, if you have someone sort of track their eyes back and forth, or there can be an EMDR could be tapping different sides, it seems to calm the part of our brain that's the threat detection center, the amygdala. So by calming that, it can allow the person to learn to regulate those uncomfortable sensations in their body, and then be able to then have a different experience with the memory that's on the table right there. And then there's several other maneuvers that you do that can allow you then to kind of re-script the memory. So then when it gets restored into long-term storage, it gets restored with that new information, and it changes your relationship to it. And often with art, and a lot of if you had like a car accident and these sort of intense sort of trauma reaction, it can often sometimes shift it in one session. It's really impressive stuff with this sort of bilateral stuff. So she's been pioneering the combination of art with ketamine. It often will be a 3-hour session where you do a full art session. And then, because in her idea, it was like, all right, we really changed the memory. Can we then use that enhanced neuroplasticity, really sear it in? And we've been seeing some really powerful results with that. So. Then we have the reduction of defenses and emotional pain. It tends to disrupt the circuitry that generates emotional pain, and that's one of the reasons why it reduces the defenses that you're engaging with. It also increases the openness because you're not feeling that extra load on top of you. Increased willingness to explore challenging psychological issues. And an important one is the social learning window. So we socially learn, what expressions, is that a face a threat? Is it a friend or a foe, or is it neutral? Is what they said, are they judging me? That's generally laid down by age 12. And it's very hard to change after that. So that the genes that are involved, they tend to generally sort of like lock up, and that's about it. What we found with the things like ketamine and the psychedelics is that can open back up again. It can actually unwind those at the DNA level and allow the brain to shift and change. It's remarkable. And I have a long-term case that I'm working on, so sometimes I use it with my psychotherapy patients that I use it once a month, right? So sort of boost, and that way we'll focus on a certain thing where it's sort of can't quite get past this issue or this other thing, and then we'll make it a factor on that. And then by engaging in that, we can actually shift. And in a couple of the cases where it was a lot of developmental stuff, you start to see like all of a sudden how they smile changes. How they look at you changes. How they're appraising whether that person is a friend or a foe is starting to shift as they're relating to other people. So that's really powerful stuff. I love it. And then multiple perspective seeking. Again, when we're depressed and anxious, we usually are rigid. We see things in one way, and it's generally very negative. So when we have this greater openness, we can think about it. You're dissociating from your body. It gives you more degrees of freedom to see things from different angles. And so that way you start to see it from this angle and that angle, and all of a sudden what you thought was this, but after seeing it from these other angles, you're like, oh, okay, and you then reinterpret it, and it changes your relationship, and that can be a game changer. So that's one of the ones that I really love about that. And then obviously the gaining of new insights. So as you can tell, this is a very powerful medicine. So you want to be very careful who you choose your ketamine treatment provider. Ketamine's enhancement of the neuroplasticity and such as it increases that possibility for both the positive and negative neuroplasticity. So you can think of ketamine and a lot of psychedelics at that therapeutic level as mind surgery. So if you were looking for a brain surgeon, you're not going to just go like willy-nilly, just choose one. But you want to make sure that you put your mind in the hands of someone who's experienced, well-trained. And one thing that Dr. Becker was very big on is that we ourselves would actually go through at least 20 guided journeys. Because I heard a phrase the other day that was like, I thought it was awesome. It was like, you can't take someone where you yourself haven't gone. And so I think it's really important that you have had guided experiences with other people and you learn from that and you're on the other side. That's the same thing true with any psychotherapy too. One of the things I tell people just as an aside, when they're searching for a psychotherapist, ask them if they themselves have had psychotherapy. They don't have to tell you about it and everything like that, but if they haven't, move on. Because you're gonna have judgments. I had tons of judgments and still have more probably to go and everything like that. It's that if you don't work on that, you're gonna project it out. And you're not gonna be aware of it. And that's where we see a lot of the problems in that. So, that's my cautionary tale. And then just at the end, obviously, is just a summation. K+ comprehensive assessment of labs, biopsychosocial, spiritual, nutritional, metabolic, inflammation, and steroids. K+ neuroplasticity, again, augmenting the neuroplasticity, supporting it, driving it towards new positive behaviors. And the last one, the positive suggestibility and malleability. And I'll leave it at that. Okay.
Yeah, that was so great. Thank you so much for that. We're going to use about the next 15 minutes for our audience Q&A. So if you do have a question, you can raise your hand and the mic will be brought to you. Okay, I'm going to pass it to you. Kindly pass it behind you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Amazing presentation. So curious to hear. I feel like in many ways right now we're using ketamine because it's the one legally available option. Mm-hmm. I'm curious to know in a future world where more things are legally available, do you think ketamine will still have a certain niche and it's best for certain things when other things are available? Or no, it's that half step, and once other things are available, people will stop using ketamine in the way that you are using it now? Yeah.
That's a great question. So obviously I'm trying to do some fortune telling, but I would say no, I think ketamine is here to stay. There's a couple of reasons for that. A lot of the psychedelics take a lot of time, so it's hard to kind of guide those. Oftentimes, LSD is like 6-7 hours, and so how are you going to do that in a medical office? It's going to have to be done in some other fashion. And also, ketamine is it's in itself is a very unique tool, and because we have so much control over it. So if I'm not, again, my wife and I, we do IM, so I can inject you and we can just go on a nice low journey. And if I want to deepen it, I can inject you with a little bit more and we go further into it. It because it's pretty short, that actually works to our advantage. And then you can then deepen it, shorten it, and tailor it in a way. And we have so much like a lot more research now on it. And then where I also see ketamine being, and this is from some of the kind of clinical, because obviously we're in a place where there's a lot of psychedelics. Santa Barbara seems to be a concentration point where that's happening. So there have been a lot of patients who told me afterwards that they were microdosing, and then they were doing ketamine. And because I had noticed something in a couple of patients where one patient was having like a little bit like more difficulty expressing grief, and then they were actually able to have a much more grief reaction. And then I learned later on that they're taking microdosing of psilocybin. So then, obviously I don't tell people you can, because I would lose my license, hey, let's start microdosing. But if they're already microdosing, then I do have some capacity to give them some guidance. And so I've often have said to some people, in certain instances, again, it's always personalized, where I would say, maybe you want to take your microdose the day before our treatment, and then that way in having the treatment, and that I found that also, that definitely turns on the backlight a lot more on there. It helps for a lot of people I think mainly it's grief. And grief work reconnects you when you can process grief, because that's one of the biggest things. If people weren't conditioned so poorly about grief, and we all can grieve healthily, I would have 80% less patients. I really believe that. So I feel like part of my job is I'm a grief midwife, and so helping people out and so I've had that benefit. And I would wish I had the component where I can actually prescribe it that way and say, hey, take them. I'm hoping we get there sooner rather than later, but right now, obviously we can only do what we have, and that's why I often use the cannabinoids as my sort of alternate sort of psychoactive agent that I use in conjunction. But ketamine also plays well with others, talking to other people and other people I really respect, and that oftentimes ketamine seems to play well on the back end. So you've done like LSD, and then after you've peaked and you're coming back down, a little bit of ketamine at the end. Done MDMA. I'm sure a lot of people who've raved have combined that combination a lot. So on the back end, a little bit of ketamine, do with a lot of these other components. So it seems to play well with others too. So I think you're going to see a lot of combos in that way, and that ketamine will be a helpful agent, usually on the back end of a lot of the trips, and also still being used as an agent of itself, because with the other agents too, what's interesting with ketamine, although it's important for setting, when it was first started to use, they were used for suicidal patients. Patients were going into the hospital, suicidal, being put on IV. Can you imagine being given LSD in that situation? So there's more of a grounding element to ketamine that the other psychedelics don't have. And that's why I think it's often used on the tail end, because sometimes when you've had those of us who've had a trip, you get that sort of unsettled position as you're coming back down. That's where I think, like in that unsettling, you don't typically get that with ketamine.
So with the ending of an experience with a 5-HTP2A receptor, anything with psilocybin, DMT, LSD, as he's mentioning, those are like such crazy touching of whatever you would call soul or energy or God, whatever that is. It's that one receptor that gets flooded, and those full agonists, they get that. This is not a full agonist, right? So it's
yes,
ketamine's not.
It's not. It does. There is some evidence that it might tickle it a little bit by increasing serotonin production in general. But yes, it doesn't really touch the 5. It's not an agonist like the other psychedelics. That's why they often don't call it a psychedelic, because they like to keep it to the serotonergic psychedelic agents. But like I said, if you're taking the term mind manifesting as is, I like to throw ketamine in there. It's working on more of the glutamate system. And that's what makes it so unique, because it's working from an entirely different system than all the other psychedelics that we know. And that's why, again, it has a special place and part of this hopefully new paradigm of treatment.
It's like there's like an pathogen and entheogen like blend. It's like the NMDA receptor affinity, that blend there, and there's some way to what you're saying is like to couple it at the end because of this. There's a lot of unknowns here, but I appreciate your speech, man. It was really good.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And to your point with the pathogenic quality, not so much on the high end, because obviously you're going to be going off but in that mid zone, because there was just a paper that came out where they're using now ketamine with couples in couples therapy. You just at a little bit of lower dose, so you're still cognitively intact and you're able to share. So we're starting to see how at these different points, and that's that fine-tuned control that we have of it, that's one of the beauties of ketamine, that we can actually do a lot, like at the lower levels, it can be empathogenic like that in that way. So, and you're more open and more receptive. So remember, those emotional pain circuitry is offline, so you can imagine then your significant other sharing something and you normally would get defensive. But now you're just open and you're just listening to it. You're not reacting to it. And then and you're in a neuroplastic state, so that's starting to help rewire yourself to that not be so reactive. So it's very cool stuff. So
Have you ever used neurofeedback while you're doing a session? Have you seen kind of done
something I would love to do.
I got a neurofeedback guy that's into everything you're into here in Santa Barbara, so I got to intro you.
I appreciate that. Yeah, no, that's one of the things we want to do. That neurofeedback, heart rate variability, those kind of things. I'm very interested in the physiology components of this stuff.
Psychedelic hypnotherapist, like a neurofeedback, done it 60 years guy. Yeah, you guys are gonna love each other.
Well, thank you. You're improving my social nutrition.
Hi, I had a question. I'm just going to rattle off a couple of them. You can answer them, so I have to keep it. I've been in the natural psilocybin healing space for like 6 years now. And I'm just curious on a couple things. One, I feel like ketamine's legal. Obviously, who owns the patent on ketamine? Is it Johnson?
Actually, right now with the patent, it's expired because it was in 1962 that Cal Stevens invented it, and then 1970 it received approval. It's one of the reasons why they tried to create S-ketamine to try to make money off of it again.
Right.
You know, but they have two now systematic reviews that have shown that S-ketamine is inferior to the racemic form, the S and R together. So.
Okay, actually, you just answered my second question. So, yeah, I was curious about the different types. But one of the things that we find, because we work in the natural psilocybin space, not the synthetic one, right? That the people that we've worked with that repeatedly use ketamine, maybe socially or they do therapy, have quite a bit of loss of memory.
That can happen if you use
Since
too much.
it's an anesthetic, right? In fact, I'm actually friends with one of the old scientists that actually was on the board or whatever at Bristol Myers, I guess in the 60s or something. And he was developing it, but he was telling me that, that's kind of what it was designed for originally, was to be an anesthetic, right?
Yes,
So loss of memory, loss of space, time, right? So
Yes, acutely.
So yeah, we're I mean, on our side, we're seeing people that use ketamine, and since it's promoted, quite heavily and legalized, is that because it did have a patent with a pharmaceutical company, is one of it. And what is your take on the memory loss? Because we were at the psychedelic conference with a booth, and there was a ketamine booth next to us, and they were saying that people start losing their memory. The actual booth was telling us that. So what is your take on that?
Sure. So to the legalization, it came out like a dissociative anesthetic. So most of the drugs that we prescribe in medicine are off-label, what we call. They didn't really get FDA approval for it. They was used for some other purpose. For instance, there's a medicine like gabapentin was first used for like epilepsy, and now now I might use it for anxiety and things like that. So, ketamine received the full approval in 1970. So then it was fully legal in 1970 as an anesthetic. Then they started to find out actually pretty quickly. The first study, if you look up, it's really hard to find, but it's in Mexico. It was 1972. They already started using it for mental health purposes, but it took a much longer period before people caught up to that. So it was like after a while, what they first discovered it had this pain relieving effect. And then when they started using it, a couple times they found out in the emergency department that all of a sudden their suicidal ideation went away. That's when the bells rang off, and they started trying it out with that, and then it sort of opened up the whole pathway as being one of the most profound antidepressants. So it doesn't require further legalization. The way the drug system works, once it's approved, you can use it off-label. So currently, right now, the status of ketamine use, if you're using racemic ketamine, because S-ketamine did get FDA approval, is off-label use. Now, when it comes to the memory loss, there definitely can be acute memory loss. It's really a matter of dose. It's like if you keep hitting it hard, you'll start to see then in the hippocampus some degradation over there. If you start hitting it like a lot frequently, especially if you're doing it like every day, or a lot of times when people are using recreationally, they'll start using it at night, and then they stay up all night snorting or whatever, however else they're doing it. And that's where I think is one of the biggest problems, whether it's ketamine, whether it's MDMA, whether it's any of these substances. I think it's one of the harder factors is why you feel like shit the next day is oftentimes because you're stayed up till 3 or 4 in the morning, and that's a double whammy. See, our brain can really handle a lot of stress, but it's like for instance, with hearing, if you go to a loud concert, and you're like, oh man, I definitely heard that. Your brain can generally, as long as it wasn't ridiculous, can repair from that. They've done studies on it. But if you go to another loud concert right after it, next day, that's when the damage usually occurs. So it's that 1-2 punch that we see. So when we look at some of the they have a couple of longer term studies that, this one was with S-ketamine. As long as it was being used in the dosing that is generally we see in the studies and what we use in our clinics, we haven't seen that sort of degradation of the hippocampus, which would then translate over to the memory deficits that you're probably seeing with other people. And I think it may be because how much they're using. It's hard to dose because a lot of people do insufflation if they're doing it recreationally. And it's hard to kind of gauge those secondary metabolites well, and also not getting the appropriate sleep surrounding it and the support around it. And oftentimes there's polydrugging that's going on that also is a confounder for whether that's occurring. But I don't like we have a couple patients that we've been using like on like a monthly basis, where I use it on a monthly basis, and I've actually, if anything, I see cognitive improvement, not deficit or memory as well. There's that dose response curve, right? Like there's at one point it's having a medicinal, and then boom, and you hit a certain threshold, and that's different for different people. Some people, what might be medicinal for one might be like detrimental to another, and that's why again that personalized kind of approach is really important.
Yo, dude, nice to meet you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Right on. Couple parts to this question. First, how do we get more time? 2. This little what was that ingredient? The
The ginkgo?
Yeah.
Ginkgo biloba.
Is that the thing that comes with a little red straw?
Now, ginkgo biloba is actually one of the oldest plants that we have. There are a couple around. They have these sort of fan-like leaves like this, and it's like they take extracts from the leaf, so it's just a pill that you would take on there. And so it's been used for quite some time, and you really want to get a good brand. Like in the supplement industry, again, it's like the wild, wild west. You can take one and say, oh, ginkgo didn't work for me. Yeah, but did you get the right brand that has the right thing and working with it? Because actually, I like to experiment with the supplements and everything, so I can tell if I take more than the dose. If I was trying a new product, I can do their certificate analysis. I take like triple the dose. If I get a headache, I know it's working, because that headache is coming from the dilatation of my arteries in my brain that hits then a pain receptor. I know then the blood flow is increasing. Great. So I can kind of do that and do it that way and work with it. So that's why I really like ginkgo for a long time.
There's a couple parts. Sorry. My bad. But also, I just wanted to kind of feed off that last question, right? With like loss of time, because mushrooms take a lot of time.
They do.
So I feel like that's maybe something that should be addressed, right? With also time and like loss of memory.
Well,
because like what do you like?
Well, with the just to tail off on when you're in the acute state of ketamine, it is like a dream. And just like if you had like a dream, like, wow, that was a great dream when I first woke up, and then you try to tell someone 11 o'clock later, and you're like, oh, I forgot it already. So that's why it's important, why we keep notes. We allow the brain and then have that person keep reviewing it afterwards, so that they can sort of bring it back in from that sort of hazy space back into when their brain is reassociating itself. So it's like in the acute phase, you are impaired, no doubt, especially if you're going into higher doses. That said, if it's used in an appropriate dose and space, and you're using those other behaviors that I'm telling you about, because there's oftentimes, like, imagine a person who's taking anabolic steroids and they're working out like crazy, and yet they don't eat any protein. And they're going to say, well, the anabolic steroids didn't work, right? Obviously, that's silly. So the same thing is true here. If we're going to stimulate the brain and we're going to stimulate the muscles, we're going to stimulate all that, we need to also provide it with the right raw materials. We need to also provide it with the right environment around there. Oftentimes where you see these deleterious effects is when the environment is not conducive to pro-adaptive healthy behaviors, where you're staying up late, and also it's important to have a guide, because most of the time, there's sometimes it's helpful to do your own solo experience if you're not having any psychological conditions and you know what you're doing. But the guide helps you to let go. You don't realize how much unconsciously we don't let go, especially by yourself, because you still have to make sure, like, if I can't go like wild, because like, but when you have someone there that's sitting with you, that you trust, that you've created an alliance with, then you can really just like, all right, I can just let go. And that's where you really can get more of those transcendent experiences, which is where we see the most bang for our buck when we're using things like ketamine. Yeah.
Dope.
Dope is dope. So,
So I think I have a question that everyone would probably enjoy. I was wondering if you don't disclose some of the information, are you able to share maybe the most bizarre experience that you've encountered with dosing someone at high dose? Or like the 20-year-old kid that's depressed that's actually the avatar. You know, like, have you seen that? Where like they just start glowing everywhere and they levitate. Like, what's the craziest shit you've seen?
well, even though I have to be careful. So let me because I'll give you like a composite so it doesn't identify anybody. I mean, one of the more interesting things, although it's powerful, is that when working with people who've been deeply traumatized, like really traumatized when they're younger, it's really fascinating to watch. There can be really intense regression that occurs where you actually hear the child voice coming from them and they look at you like a child. And it's beautiful, and especially because that there's this openness in working with it, and that there's this openness, this vulnerability because they usually are riddled with so much shame and so like that. But it's amazing when you first hear it, and you have this voice like this, and all of a sudden they're like this, it's like wow. So that's one of the more powerful things and that's really needs to be handled with great care. But it's a really powerful, can be a really powerful experience.
What do you like to call it? Midwife. What was it? Shame midwife. Midwife what? No.
Oh, grief midwife.
That was dope. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sweet. Michael's a popular guy at the district house. I have a final few questions for you, and they are with the intention of being rapid fire. So you're not going to give the wrong answer, but I do encourage the first response that comes to mind. So my first question, I'm going to go out of order here.
Yes. No.
Do you believe in an afterlife? And if so, what do you think that is? And through psychedelics, can we access portions of it?
Anybody heard of Bernardo Kastrup, for chance? So he proposes something called analytic idealism, and it's that, the world that appears physical is actually mental in its nature, or consciousness as the sort of the that is the realm that it is, and that what we're having, that the experience we're currently having is so there's a condition called dissociative identity disorder, where people have multiple parts, multiple personalities. And the way he describes it is that we are currently still all one, but we're all partially dissociated from each other. So we have our own mental experiences, like you can't have my thoughts, but you have your own thoughts, but we also are sharing a lot. So we're sort of dissociated, and the rest of the world is all associated. And that death is the unwinding of that dissociation, and you're reassociating with the one. So what I have with this idea, and I wanted to actually contact him in regards to maybe doing some research on this, is that what if the idea of, it's like a double flip, right? So the idea is like this. Ketamine is a dissociative agent, and that people have these very profound responses. Perhaps if we're already sort of dissociated and you add another, it's like two negatives equals a positive. What if we add another dissociative agent and it actually acts like you kissing the reassociation principle, so that you're actually reassociating with everything that is the one. So in my meditation practice, is not like it's like I don't think that time and like the time and space are the ultimate reality. That what's going on is there is being and there's becoming. So being is timeless. There's nothing else here. So there is the consciousness that is projecting through my body. The self that I am, the Dr. Michael Mantz, that's just a label. That's just a pattern of behaviors and thoughts and things that are adaptive, that are helpful at times, and that at death is just the unwinding back into the being, the timeless realm. That's my current way of looking at it.
In response, my next question is, do we exist in a simulation? And if yes, what is your definition of that?
Huh. You ever listen to Donald Hoffman? So Donald Hoffman, they've done some sort of work on it, and that it's like, do we actually see a chair there? And so it's like, and so when they looked at using evolutionary theory and just thinking like, based on like whether something would give you evolutionary points, whether it's something that would help nourish you or something that you can procreate with or something that would be detrimental to your response, and how much do we actually need to know about an object to really do the best in the evolutionary game. So when they run that in there, they find out that the actual percentage of what we see of reality is 0 in that case. So it's very interesting theory, and that what we're seeing is more of a dashboard of experience, and it's based on our sort of the evolutionary game that we're currently playing together. And so I find that an interesting and intriguing idea. So I'm not sure if like in the simulation, like someone else is simulating it. I think it's all of us just sort of having this projection. And we're sort of having this sort of shared experience together.
Yeah, totally. I really like that response. Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
I'm also curious, is there a psychedelic or a substance that you have personal curiosity about exploring but haven't yet?
Ayahuasca. Yeah. I mean, I don't have much, very like, I had some friend that had a microdose that I had, but that was about it. So I'm curious about the DMT, the tryptamine realm. I'm doing that, but I also have a condition called POTS, which is a thing that affects my heart rate. So I have to be on certain medications to rate control it. So when you go to a lot of these things, you have to kind of purge and do these fasting things, and that would make my system, run amok. So it's kept me from being able to explore that. But I just find that to be very interesting realm, the DMT realm. It's something I haven't explored.
And my last question to end this gorgeous talk that you've offered us tonight. To the best of your ability, will you please describe the nature of consciousness?
Actually, you asked me an impossible question. For me to put words on what consciousness is, it would be actually sacrilegious to consciousness itself. It's, I guess the best way when I'm sinking into it, it's open, aware, spacious, loving, beauty. It has these different facets and qualities, peace. Again, these are all labels. They're not it. They just try to help point to it. So when the sense of self is sort of dissolving and you're just sort of being, that's the best I can do. So,
Thank you.
You're welcome.